The Dakota Territory winter of 1867 descended like God's own judgment, brutal, merciless, and indiscriminate in its fury. But for Rebecca Winters, the howling winds and bone-chilling cold were a mere echo of the devastation that had already claimed everything she held dear. Huddled beneath the broken remains of a wagon, her husband's blood still staining her skirts, Rebecca pressed trembling hands against her swollen belly and prayed for death. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of a woman who survived when 17 others perished in what would become known as the Clearwater Creek Massacre, only to face nature's cruelest season alone and with child. And it's the story of Thomas Eagle Shield, a Lakota scout whose decision to follow strange tracks in fresh snow would forever alter two lives from worlds that had been taught to fear each other. Their unlikely bond would challenge the deepest prejudices of a divided territory and prove that sometimes home isn't a place at all, but the people who refuse to let you face the storm alone. Rebecca couldn't feel her feet anymore. 3 days of walking through deepening snow had stolen all sensation below her ankles, replacing it with a strange, detached lightness that somehow frightened her more than pain. Darkness was falling fast, as it always did in December, the sun abandoning the Dakota plains with indecent haste. She needed shelter. The baby needed shelter. The child inside her kicked vigorously, as if protesting the cold or perhaps her mother's faltering steps. Rebecca placed her raw, chapped hand on the swell of her belly. "I know," she whispered, her voice snatched away by the rising wind. "I'm trying." The memories she fought to suppress returned with cruel clarity in these moments of weakness. A crack of rifles shattering the dawn, Samuel shouting for her to run as he reached for the shotgun they kept beneath the wagon seat. The terrible sounds that followed, screams, war cries, the dull thud of arrows finding flesh. She had crawled beneath the wagon, paralyzed with terror, watching through gaps in the floorboards as familiar boots staggered, then crumpled into the dirt. Rebecca stumbled, catching herself against a barren tree. Her wedding ring snagged on, the rough bark, the simple gold band Samuel had placed on her finger just 14 months ago in the small Illinois church where they'd made their vows. Before the war took their farm, before they decided to join the wagon train west for a fresh start, before everything ended at Clearwater Creek, they'd found her the next morning, 2 soldiers from Fort Abercrombie on patrol who'd seen the smoke, in from burned wagons. She hadn't spoken for 2 days after that, not when they buried the 17 dead in a mass grave beside the creek, not when they debated what to do with her at the fort, not when Captain Blackwood declared the massacre would demand retribution. She'd only broken her silence when she overheard them planning to send her back east. "I'm going west," she'd said, her voice rusty from disuse. "To Oregon, like we planned." The fort commander had looked at her as if she'd lost her mind. Perhaps she had. "Mrs. Winters, you're in no condition to travel, certainly not with winter coming. You'll stay at the fort until spring, and then we'll arrange safe passage back to your family." "I have no family," she'd replied, "and I won't stay where Samuel is buried. I won't." 2 weeks of argument had followed, but Rebecca had been adamant. She'd secured a place with a supply wagon heading to a trading post 50 miles west, the last transport before winter closed the trails. From there, she planned to find another party traveling to Oregon once the snows melted. The wagon had departed 3 days ago with provisions, her few remaining possessions, and the captain's reluctant blessing. That morning, they'd encountered a washed-out bridge, The driver had declared they'd need to detour 20 miles south. Anxiety had clawed at Rebecca's chest. Every day of delay increased the risk of being trapped by the approaching storms. "I'll continue on foot," she'd announced. "The trading post is only a day's walk following the river." The driver had called her crazy. The captain's wife, Mrs. Blackwood, who'd been traveling to visit her sister, had been more direct. "You'll die out there, you and your fatherless child. But perhaps that's what you want." The cruelty had barely registered. Rebecca had collected what she could carry, a small pack with jerky, hardtack, a canteen, flint, Samuel's hunting knife, and the journal she'd kept since leaving Illinois. She'd wrapped herself in every layer she owned and set out alone. 1 day's walk. That had been her miscalculation. She hadn't accounted for her slowing pace, her increasing need to rest, or the snow that began falling that afternoon, erasing landmarks and deepening with every hour. Night had fallen on the first day with no sign of the trading post. She'd made a meager camp beneath a rocky outcropping, building a small fire that had sputtered against the damp wood and died by midnight. The second day had been worse, heavier. Snow, stronger winds, and the growing certainty that she'd strayed from the river path. Still, she'd pushed on, knowing that stopping meant death. Now, as the third day waned, Rebecca could no longer deny the truth. She was lost. The baby was due in less than a month, and the storm was worsening. Ahead, through the thickening curtain of white, she spotted a dark line of pines. Trees meant some shelter from the wind, possibly deadfall for a fire. Rebecca angled toward them, each step an act of will against exhaustion and cold. The pines loomed closer, their needled branches promising at least some barrier against the relentless snow. As she reached the first tree, a contraction seized her, sudden and vicious. Rebecca gasped, clutching her belly. Too soon. It was too soon. "Not here," she pleaded, unsure if she was addressing the baby, God, or the uncaring wilderness around her. "Not yet, please." The contraction passed, leaving her trembling. False labor, she told herself, brought on by cold and exertion. The real thing would be worse, more regular. She knew this from helping at 3 births back home. Rebecca pushed deeper into the pines, searching for a suitable place to stop. The snow was shallower here, the ground carpeted with fallen needles. She found a massive trunk that had toppled, creating a small hollow where its roots had torn free. Of the earth, it wasn't much, but it would block the wind from one direction. With stiff fingers, she gathered what dry wood she could find beneath the surrounding trees. The bundle was pathetically small, but it would have to do. Using Samuel's knife, she scraped shavings from the driest piece, working methodically despite her shaking hands. The flint sparked several times before catching. Rebecca hunched over the tiny flame, shielding it with her body, feeding it carefully until a small fire took hold. The heat was barely noticeable against the deepening cold, but its light provided a fragile center to her world. Rebecca unpacked her meager supplies, rationing a small piece of jerky and a few sips of water that had started to freeze in her canteen. Then she spread her blanket in the hollow and huddled as close to the fire as she dared. Another contraction rippled across her abdomen, stronger than the first. Rebecca bit her lip against a cry. Not false labor then. The realization settled like ice in her veins. She was alone in a snowstorm, in labor, miles from any help. "Samuel," she whispered, pressing her wedding ring to her lips. "I don't know if I can do this without you." The wind howled in response, driving snow between the trees in spectral shapes. Rebecca's fire flickered, threatening to die. With careful movements, she added her last pieces of wood. The flames strengthened briefly, then subsided to a sullen glow that would be gone within the hour. As darkness thickened around her, Rebecca pulled her journal from her pack. The leather-bound book had been Samuel's gift on their departure from Illinois, a place to record their new beginning. Instead, It had become a chronicle of loss. She flipped to the last blank page, the pencil awkward in her numb fingers. December 17th, 1867. I fear this will be my final entry. The baby comes too soon, and I have no strength left. Samuel, my love, I tried to keep our dream alive. I tried to reach Oregon for both of us. Forgive me. If anyone finds this, please know that Samuel Winters and his wife Rebecca lived and loved and dared to hope for better days. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The writing was barely legible, the letters wavering across the page. Rebecca closed the journal and tucked it inside her coat, close to her heart. Another contraction seized her, lasting longer this time. She bit down on her sleeve to muffle her cry. As the pain receded, she became aware of a new sound beneath the storm's fury, the distant howl of wolves. The sound chilled her more thoroughly than the snow. Wolves normally avoided humans, but hunger in winter could make them bold. The scent of blood from childbirth would draw them like a beacon. Not like this, Rebecca whispered, reaching for Samuel's knife. She wouldn't die without a fight, wouldn't let her child be taken by wolves or cold. Somehow, she would survive until morning. But as the fire dimmed to embers and the contractions strengthened, Rebecca felt her resolve wavering. Her head drooped, exhaustion pulling her toward unconsciousness despite the danger. The knife slipped from her grasp. She forced her eyes open, struggling to stay alert, but the darkness at the edges of her vision continued to encroach. Through the falling snow, through her pain and fading awareness, Rebecca thought she saw movement at the periphery of the dying firelight. A tall figure, too straight back to be a wolf, watching silently from between the trees. Fear and hope warred within her failing consciousness. Help, she tried to call, but the word emerged as barely a whisper. The figure moved closer, features indistinct in the near darkness. Rebecca caught a glimpse of dark eyes in a copper-skinned face before another contraction overwhelmed her, pulling her down into a void where pain and cold finally ceased to matter. Thomas Eagle Shield had not planned to travel this far north. His assignment from the fort commander had been simple: scout the Southern Territories for signs of the band believed responsible for the Clearwater Creek attack. He'd completed that task 2 days ago, finding nothing but old tracks heading toward the Black Hills. The band had moved on, as he'd expected. The attack had been opportunistic, not planned, a response to the slaughter of a hunting party the month before by nervous settlers who shot first and discovered their mistake later. Thomas understood both sides of the bloody equation better than most. Educated at a mission school, before returning to his people, he spoke English as fluently as Lakota. He could read the white man's books and navigate his strange customs. This made him useful to both worlds, but fully trusted by neither. The army valued his tracking skills and knowledge of the territory, but kept him at arm's length. His own people respected his ability to negotiate with the whites, but questioned his divided loyalties. He'd planned to return to Fort Abercrombie with his report, but the approaching storm had forced him to seek shelter with his mother's cousins at the winter camp near Eagle Butte. He'd been there 2 days when the dream came. In it, a woman with hair the color of autumn grass stood beside a dying fire, her belly swollen with child, her eyes fixed on his with desperate intensity. Behind her, a great white wolf watched, patient and hungry, waiting for her strength to fail. The dream had woken him in the darkest hour before dawn, his heart pounding with a certainty he couldn't explain. Someone was out there in the storm. Someone who needed him. The elders spoke of such dreams, messages from the spirits that could not be ignored. By first light, Thomas had packed supplies, taken his strongest horse, and ridden north despite his cousin's warnings about the worsening weather. He'd followed nothing but instinct, riding for hours through deepening snow, beginning to doubt his own sanity as daylight waned with no sign of anything but endless white plains and scattered stands of pine. Then he'd seen it, a thin wisp of smoke rising from a copse of trees, so faint it might have been a trick of the fading light. Fear crossed Rebecca's face, but she squared her shoulders with visible effort. "I've assisted at births, though I've never—" She paused, another contraction overwhelming her. When it passed, she continued with grim determination. "We'll manage. Together. First, I need to get out of these wet clothes." Thomas nodded and turned his back, giving her privacy while remaining within the small shelter. He listened to the rustle of fabric as she shed her outer layers. "There are clean clothes in my pack," he offered. "Small for you, but dry." "Thank you," she said, her voice strained. "I'm decent now. You can turn around." Rebecca had kept her chemise, but removed her sodden dress and petticoats. Wrapped in the buffalo robe, with her hair falling loose around her shoulders, she looked younger and more vulnerable. Thomas guessed she couldn't be more than 25. Though hardship had etched lines around her eyes that spoke of older sorrows. "How did you find me?" she asked as he added more wood to the fire. Thomas hesitated. White people were skeptical of dreams and spirit messages. "I was tracking in this area," he said simply. "Saw your fire." Rebecca seemed to accept this, though her gaze remained questioning. Before she could press further, another contraction seized her, stronger than before. She gasped, curling forward. "They're coming faster," she panted when it passed. "The baby won't wait much longer." Thomas moved with calm efficiency, preparing as best he could with limited resources. He laid out his cleanest shirt to wrap the infant, positioned his water canteen and knife within reach, and built up the fire until the small shelter was almost uncomfortably warm. "Tell me what to do," he repeated, kneeling beside her. Rebecca's face was flushed now, her earlier pallor replaced by the hectic color of exertion. "Just be ready to catch the baby. Make sure the cord isn't around the neck. Keep us both warm." Thomas nodded, his expression grave with the responsibility. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, snow accumulating against their fragile shelter. Inside, the fire crackled, casting dancing shadows as Rebecca Winters prepared to bring new life into a world that had already taken so much from her. The hours that followed burned themselves into Thomas's memory with the clarity of lightning against a night sky. Rebecca's courage as she fought through pain that would have broken many warriors. The strange intimacy of sharing this most primal of human experiences with a woman who had been a stranger hours before. The moment when fear threatened to overcome her and she clutched his hand with desperate strength. "I can't," she'd gasped as a particularly vicious contraction peaked. "Samuel should be here, not me alone, not like this." "You are not alone," Thomas had replied, returning her grip with gentle pressure. "And you are stronger than you know." Something had passed between them then, a recognition, perhaps, of shared humanity that transcended the boundaries their peoples had drawn. Rebecca had nodded once, gathered her strength, and continued the battle to bring her child into the world. Near midnight, with the storm at its height, Rebecca's labor reached its climax. Thomas positioned himself as she directed, his hand steady despite the tremendous responsibility. "Now," Rebecca commanded, her voice raw from hours of labor. "The baby comes now." Thomas caught the infant as it slipped into the world, a tiny, perfect being, slick with birth and impossibly vulnerable. For a heartbeat, the child was silent, and terror gripped him. Then the night air touched new lungs, and the baby unleashed a fierce, indignant cry that filled their shelter. "A girl," Thomas said, his voice thick with unexpected emotion. "You have a daughter." He wrapped the infant in his clean shirt and placed her on Rebecca's chest. The new mother's exhausted face transformed, wonder replacing pain as she gazed at her child. "Emma," she whispered, touching the damp curls that already showed hints of her own amber color. "Her name is Emma." Thomas busied himself with the practical necessities, cutting and tying the cord as Rebecca instructed, helping deliver the afterbirth, making sure both mother and child were clean and warm. Throughout it all, a strange sense of privilege filled him. He had witnessed something profound, something sacred that few men of his people were ever permitted to see. When all was settled, Thomas stepped outside briefly to offer a prayer of thanks to Wagon, the Great Mystery, for guiding him to this place and for the safe delivery of the child. The storm had begun to abate, stars appearing between racing clouds. In the east, the faintest lightening of the sky hinted at approaching dawn. Inside, he found Rebecca gazing at her sleeping daughter with an expression of fierce protectiveness. "We need to move at first light," Thomas said gently. "This shelter won't hold if the storm returns." Rebecca looked up, the reality of their situation returning to her tired eyes. "Where will we go?" It was a question with no simple answer. The fort was at least 2 days' journey in Rebecca's weakened condition. The Lakota winter camp was closer, but bringing a white woman there, particularly one connected to the fort, carried its own risks. "I have a cabin," Thomas said finally. "About half a day's ride south. It's small but solid. We can rest there until you're strong enough to travel further." "A cabin? You don't live with your people?" Thomas arranged more wood on the fire, buying time to frame his response. "I live between worlds," he said eventually. "It's complicated." Rebecca nodded, accepting this cryptic answer with the pragmatism of a woman who had survived against impossible odds. "We'll go to your cabin then. Thank you, Mr. Eagle Shield, for everything." "Thomas," he corrected. "Just Thomas." "Thomas," she repeated, her exhaustion finally claiming her as she drifted towards sleep, one hand still protectively curved around her newborn daughter. Thomas settled himself on the opposite side of the fire, prepared to keep watch through what remained of the night. He studied the woman and child sleeping across from him, marveling at the strange turns of fate that had brought them together. In this wilderness, his people taught that all lives were connected in the sacred hoop, each journey intersecting with others in ways that might not be immediately understood, but were never without purpose. What purpose had brought Rebecca Winters into his path? What would come of the bond forged in this night of struggle and miracle? Outside, the wind quieted to a whisper. Inside their shelter, the fire burned steady and strong, holding back the darkness for a few precious hours of peace before the challenges that awaited with the dawn. Dawn arrived with merciful gentleness, pale light filtering through the shelters, covering as the storm receded into memory. Thomas had dozed only briefly, his body trained by years as a scout to remain alert even in rest. He stirred the fire's embers, coaxing fresh flames from the glowing heart of ash and char. The small space had retained its warmth through the night, a pocket of life amid the frozen wilderness. Rebecca slept on, her face softened in repose, one arm still protectively curved around Emma. The newborn occasionally made small mewling sounds, but seemed remarkably content for a child born under such desperate circumstances. Thomas studied them both, struck by the vulnerability and strength embodied in their sleeping forms. A woman who had survived massacre and childbirth in the heart of winter. A child whose first breath came in a world determined to deny her very existence. He moved quietly, preparing for their journey. The storm had passed, but had left nearly 2 feet of fresh snow, difficult for a healthy person to navigate, nearly impossible for a woman recovering from childbirth. They would need the horse, his strongest mount, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Wagon, who had carried him through many perilous situations. Emma's cry, high and insistent, broke the morning stillness. Rebecca woke instantly, her eyes flying open with the alertness of new motherhood. It took her a moment to register her surroundings, confusion flickering across her features before memory returned. "Good morning," Thomas said, keeping his voice low and calm. "The storm has passed." Rebecca shifted carefully to a sitting position, wincing at the movement. "Morning," she replied, her attention already focused on Emma. With practiced motions that seemed instinctive rather than learned, she adjusted her clothing to nurse the hungry infant. Her cheeks colored slightly at performing such an intimate act in front of a stranger, but necessity overruled modesty. Thomas busied himself with packing their meager supplies, offering what privacy he could within the confined space. "We should leave soon," he said without looking in her direction. "There's much ground to cover, and daylight is precious in winter." "How far is your cabin?" Rebecca asked, her voice steadier than the previous night. "Half a day's journey in good conditions. Perhaps longer now with the snow." He hesitated, then added, "You will ride, Wagon, my horse. I will walk and lead him." "That seems unfair to you." Thomas almost smiled at her concern for his comfort when she was the one who had just delivered a child in a snowstorm. "I'm accustomed to long journeys on foot. You need to conserve your strength." He stepped outside to prepare the horse, allowing Rebecca privacy to ready herself and the baby. The world beyond their shelter was transformed, a vast expanse of unbroken white, trees bowed under the weight of snow, the sky a clear, brittle blue that promised bitter cold despite the sunshine. Thomas secured his packs to Wagon's saddle, then fashioned a carrying sling for Emma from a spare blanket. When he returned, Rebecca was dressed in her now dried clothing, her hair braided and pinned beneath her woolen cap. Despite the pallor of exhaustion, she had a dignity about her that impressed Thomas. This was a woman unaccustomed to surrender. "I brought something for the child," he said, offering the improvised sling. "It will keep her warm against your body and leave your hands free." Rebecca examined the simple but effective carrier. "Like your people use," she observed. "Yes, our mothers carry their babies this way while working or traveling. The child is secure, and they can feel the mother's heartbeat." Rebecca nodded and allowed Thomas to help her position Emma in the sling. The baby settled immediately against her mother's warmth, dark lashes fanning against pink cheeks. "She's so calm," Rebecca marveled, "as if she understands we need to travel." "Children know more than we give them credit for," Thomas replied. "Are you ready?" The question encompassed more than their immediate departure. It acknowledged the uncertain journey ahead, the questions still unanswered between them, the fragile trust that necessity had forged in the night. "Yes," Rebecca said simply. Thomas dismantled their shelter quickly, scattering the branches and returning the forest floor to its natural state as much as possible. His people left no trace of their passage when they could avoid it, a habit born of both respect for the land and the practical need for secrecy in increasingly contested territory. Helping Rebecca mount Wagon proved challenging. Her body was stiff with the aftermath of childbirth, and every movement clearly caused her pain, though she made no complaint. Finally settled in the saddle with Emma secure against her chest, she looked down at Thomas with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. "I never thought I'd be grateful to encounter a Lakota after what happened at Clearwater Creek," she said quietly. "Life has strange turns." Thomas met her gaze steadily. "The men who attacked your wagon train were not my band, but they were responding to their own losses, a hunting party killed by nervous settlers the month before." Rebecca stiffened slightly. "You defend them," I explained. "There is a difference." Thomas adjusted Wagon's bridle. "Violence answers violence until someone chooses a different path." He didn't wait for her response, but began leading the horse southward through the trees, breaking trail through the deep snow. Behind him, Rebecca remained silent, perhaps considering his words or simply conserving her energy for the journey ahead. They traveled slowly, the horse picking its way carefully through the snow-laden landscape. Thomas set a deliberate pace, mindful of Rebecca's condition and the precious cargo she carried. Occasionally he would stop, surveying the horizon with the practiced eye of a scout before continuing on their path. As the sun climbed higher, Rebecca finally spoke again. "You said you scout for the army sometimes. Were you looking for the Lakota who attacked our wagon train?" Thomas considered how much to tell her. "Yes. Captain Blackwood sent me to find their trail." "And did you?" "I found signs they had moved toward the Black Hills." He didn't add that he had deliberately provided vague information in his report, knowing what would happen if the army located the band. The attack had been wrong, but wholesale retribution would only continue the cycle of bloodshed. "I see." Rebecca adjusted Emma in her sling. "And instead of returning to the fort, you somehow found me." Thomas kept his eyes on the trail ahead. The storm was coming. I sought shelter with relatives nearby. He paused, then decided on honesty. "I had a dream that someone needed help. I followed it." He expected skepticism, or perhaps nervous superstition. Instead, Rebecca was quiet for several long moments before responding. "My grandmother believed in such things, dreams that show the future or guide the dreamer. My father called it old country nonsense, but she insisted some people had the gift." Another pause. "I'm glad you listened to your dream, Mr. Eagleshield." "Thomas," he reminded her. "Thomas," she amended. "And you should call me Rebecca." It was a small gesture of familiarity, but significant, coming from a white woman to a Lakota man in 1867. Thomas inclined his head in acknowledgement and continued breaking trail through the snow. By midday, the temperature had risen enough to make the snow heavy and wet, clinging to Thomas's leggings and making each step more laborious. Rebecca had fallen into a light doze in the saddle, her body swaying gently with the horse's movement, while one hand remained protectively on Emma. Thomas allowed her rest, guiding Wagon around obstacles without disturbing their rhythm. When the sun reached its zenith, he stopped in a small clearing where a fallen log offered a natural bench cleared of snow by overhanging branches. Rebecca stirred as the horse halted. "We'll rest here briefly," Thomas explained. "Eat something. The cabin is still several hours away." He helped her dismount, noting her stiffness with concern. Birth in such conditions often led to fever or worse. Among his people, a new mother would rest for days, attended by experienced women who knew the signs of danger. Rebecca had no such luxury. They sat on the fallen log, while Thomas produced dried meat, hard bread, and a handful of dried berries from his pack. Rebecca accepted the food gratefully, though she ate sparingly. Her attention focused on Emma, who had awakened and begun to fuss. "She needs changing," Rebecca said, her expression troubled as she surveyed their limited supplies. Without comment, Thomas reached into his pack and removed a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were several squares of soft tanned deerskin. "My cousin's wife prepared these for her coming child," he explained. "She will not mind sharing with one who needs them more." Rebecca accepted the impromptu diapers with visible relief. "Please thank her for me when you can. You may thank her yourself later," Thomas replied, turning away to give her privacy for the task. "My people are not the monsters of campfire tales." Behind him, Rebecca was quiet as she tended to Emma. When she spoke again, her voice held a note of genuine curiosity rather than defensiveness. "Tell me about your people then, not the stories from the fort, but the truth as you know it." It was a request Thomas had rarely encountered from white settlers, who generally preferred their preconceptions unchallenged. He selected his words with care, aware of both the opportunity and the risk in sharing too much of his heart with this woman who, despite their shared ordeal, remained a stranger. We call ourselves Lakota, meaning allies or friends. We are part of the 7 Council Fires, what your people call the Sioux Nation, though that name was given by enemies, not chosen by us. He gestured to the world around them. This land has been our home for many generations. We follow the buffalo, live according to the seasons, and believe that all things, animals, plants, stones, even the wind, have spirit and deserve respect. Rebecca listened attentively as she finished changing Emma and settled the baby back against her chest. "And your family?" she asked. "You mentioned relatives nearby." Thomas's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "My father was a respected warrior of the Hunkpapa band. He died when I was 12, killed by soldiers during a dispute over hunting grounds. My mother is sister to Chief Running Horse of the Minneconjou. She sent me to the mission school to learn the white man's ways, believing it was the only path to survival for our people. He did not share the pain of those years, the loneliness, the beatings for speaking his own language, the gradual stripping away of identity that the teachers called civilization. Some wounds were too private to expose, even in the strange intimacy that had developed between them. And now you work for the army that killed your father," Rebecca observed, her tone free of judgment but heavy with awareness of the irony. "I work between worlds," Thomas corrected. "I use what I learned to protect my people when I can. Sometimes that means helping the army avoid unnecessary conflict. Sometimes it means warning my people of coming danger." He met her gaze directly. "I have no illusions about where true loyalty would be demanded if war comes in earnest." Rebecca nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "A difficult position." "Life is often difficult," Thomas replied with a slight shrug. "We each find our path through it as best we can." He stood, gathering their meager supplies. "We should continue. There are still many miles ahead." As he helped Rebecca back onto Wagon, he was acutely aware of her wince of pain. "Are you able to continue?" he asked quietly. "I don't have much choice, do I?" she responded with a wry smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'll manage." Thomas recognized the determination that had kept her moving through snow and labor alike. Without further comment, he resumed leading the horse southward, his moccasins finding purchase in the treacherous snow through long practice and innate knowledge of how to distribute his weight. The afternoon stretched before them, the sun occasionally disappearing behind clouds only to emerge again, casting the snow-covered landscape in alternating shadow and brilliant light. Thomas maintained a steady pace, pausing only when necessary to ensure they were still following the correct route. To the untrained eye, the terrain might have seemed featureless, but he read it like a familiar text. This cluster of pines, that distinctive rock formation, the subtle rise of land that marked the approach to the valley where his cabin waited. Rebecca had fallen silent, conserving her strength for the journey. Occasionally, Thomas would glance back to check on her, finding her upright in the saddle through sheer force of will, her face pale but composed, Emma sleeping peacefully in her sling. Once, catching his concerned look, she managed a brief smile. "I'm all right," she assured him. "Just tired." Thomas nodded, though he wasn't convinced. He had seen that particular pallor before, the grey undertone to the skin that spoke of a body pushed beyond its limits. They needed to reach shelter soon. As the afternoon waned toward evening, the temperature began to drop precipitously. Thomas quickened their pace as much as the conditions allowed, scanning the horizon anxiously for the landmark that would indicate they were nearing his cabin, a distinctive outcropping of rock that local Lakota called the Sleeping Wolf for its shape. When it finally came into view, relief coursed through him. "Not much farther now," he called over his shoulder. "The cabin lies just beyond that rise." Rebecca straightened in the saddle, her exhaustion momentarily overcome by the promise of proper shelter. "Thank God," she murmured. They crested the rise as the sun touched the western horizon, painting the snow-covered valley below in hues of gold and rose. In the center of the small valley, nestled against a stand of pines for protection from the northern winds, stood Thomas's cabin, a sturdy structure built of hand-hewn logs with a stone chimney rising from its sloped roof. Nearby stood a small stable for Wagon and the 2 mules Thomas kept for work and packing. "Your cabin," Rebecca said, surprise evident in her tone. "It's not what I expected." Thomas understood her reaction. Most whites imagined Lakota living exclusively in teepees, moving constantly with the seasons. Few recognized that many of his people had adopted elements of settler life while maintaining their core values and traditions. "My grandfather built it as a winter refuge," he explained as they descended into the valley. "I added to it over the years." The last quarter mile seemed to take an eternity, but finally they stood before the cabin door. Thomas helped Rebecca dismount, noting with concern how heavily she leaned on his arm. Emma had awakened and begun to fuss, sensing her mother's discomfort, or perhaps hungry again after the long journey. "Wait here," Thomas said, settling Rebecca on a bench beside the door. "I need to check inside first, make sure all is well." The cabin had been empty for nearly 2 weeks, and while he doubted anyone had disturbed it in his absence, caution was a habit too deeply ingrained to ignore. He entered quickly, surveying the single large room that comprised the main living space. All was as he had left it, neat and orderly, with firewood stacked beside the stone hearth, his few possessions arranged on simple shelves, the bed in the corner covered with furs and blankets. Satisfied, Thomas returned for Rebecca, helping. Across the threshold with Emma still secured against her chest. The interior was cold, but would warm quickly once the fire was lit. He settled Rebecca on the bed, then moved with practiced efficiency to start a fire in the hearth, using tinder, and kindling prepared before his departure. As flames caught and began to dance upward, Rebecca looked around the cabin with undisguised curiosity. The space reflected Thomas's dual heritage. Practical furnishings like those found in any settler's home stood alongside distinctly Lakota elements. A buffalo skull adorned one wall, painted with symbols in red and black. Woven baskets held dried herbs and roots. A beautifully beaded medicine pouch hung near the door. But what seemed to catch Rebecca's attention most was the small shelf of books near the bed, perhaps a dozen volumes, their leather bindings well worn from use. "You read," she observed, surprise again coloring her voice. "The mission school taught me that much at least," Thomas replied, his tone deliberately neutral. He had long ago ceased being offended by the assumptions whites made about his intelligence or capabilities. "I didn't mean," Rebecca began, then stopped herself. "I'm sorry, that was thoughtless of me." Thomas looked up from the fire, meeting her gaze. "You're tired and in pain. Thoughtlessness can be forgiven." Emma's cries grew more insistent, drawing Rebecca's attention away from the awkward moment. She adjusted her clothing to nurse the infant, her movements becoming more practiced with each feeding. "I'll see to Wagon and bring in our supplies," Thomas said, stepping toward the door. "Rest while you can." Outside, the temperature continued to drop as twilight deepened into true night. Thomas worked quickly, unsaddling Wagon and rubbing him down before leading him into the small stable where the mules greeted their companion with soft wickers of welcome. He provided hay and fresh water for all 3 animals, then gathered the saddlebags containing their few possessions. When he returned to the cabin, he found Rebecca had fallen asleep with Emma still at her breast. The fire had begun to warm, the space casting flickering shadows across the sleeping pair. With quiet movements, Thomas added more wood to ensure the flames would last, then retrieved a pot to melt snow for water. They would need it for washing and drinking both. As he worked, Thomas considered their situation with the pragmatism of a man accustomed to surviving in harsh conditions. Rebecca needed rest and proper food to recover her strength and maintain milk for the baby. The cabin was well stocked with dried meat, beans, flour, and preserved foods that would last through winter, but fresh milk and vegetables were impossible until spring. They would manage, but he would need to hunt soon to provide fresh meat. More complex were the social implications of their arrangement. A white woman and her infant living alone with a Lakota man in a remote cabin, it would raise eyebrows. At best, provoke violence at worst if discovered by the wrong people. The fort would be searching for Rebecca once they realized she hadn't reached the trading post. Captain Blackwood was not a man to leave loose ends untied, particularly when they involved a white woman in his charge. Thomas sighed, setting water to heat on the hook above the fire. These were concerns for tomorrow. Tonight, they had achieved what had seemed impossible that morning: safe passage through deep snow to secure shelter. With both mother and child alive and relatively well, Rebecca stirred as he moved about the cabin, her eyes opening with the immediate alertness of new motherhood. She carefully shifted Emma, who had fallen asleep, and adjusted her clothing. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I didn't mean to doze off." "You need rest," Thomas replied. "There's no need to apologize." He gestured to the pot of warming water. "I've put water on for washing. Are you hungry?" Rebecca nodded, carefully sitting up straighter against the pillows. "Starving, actually. I can't remember the last proper meal I had." Thomas moved to a small cupboard built into one wall, retrieving dried meat, a sack of flour, and preserved berries. "I can make flatbread and stew, simple but filling." "That sounds wonderful." Rebecca glanced down at Emma, sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Is there somewhere I can lay her down? My arms are aching." Thomas considered the cabin's limited furnishings. "I'll arrange something," he promised. With efficient movements, he gathered several of the smaller furs from storage and a shallow wooden box he sometimes used for carrying supplies. He lined the box with the softest furs, creating a makeshift cradle that he placed next to the bed within Rebecca's reach. "It's not fancy," he acknowledged, "but it will keep her warm and safe." Rebecca carefully transferred Emma to the improvised bed, the baby sighing softly but not waking. "It's perfect," she said, genuine gratitude in her voice. "Thank you." As Thomas prepared their meal, combining dried meat with herbs and the last of some dried vegetables to make a simple but nourishing stew, Rebecca watched him with evident curiosity. "You're very self-sufficient," she observed. "Most men I've known couldn't cook to save their lives." Thomas smiled slightly as he worked the flour into dough for flatbread. "Necessity is an effective teacher. I live alone most of the time, and even when traveling with others, everyone contributes to camp duties." "That makes sense." Rebecca shifted position carefully, wincing at the movement. "Samuel, my husband, was the same way. On the journey west, he learned to cook and mend alongside me, said there was no point in starving or going ragged just because men back east didn't learn such things. It was the first time she had voluntarily mentioned her husband. Thomas noted the shadow that crossed her face, but didn't press for more information. Instead, he shaped the dough into rounds and placed them on hot stones near the fire to bake. "Your husband sounds like a practical man," he said simply. Rebecca's hand went to the gold band she still wore. "He was practical and kind and brave." Her voice caught slightly. "He died trying to protect me at Clearwater Creek, shot while reaching for his rifle." Thomas remained silent, allowing her the space to speak or not as she chose. After a moment, Rebecca continued, the words coming as if a dam had broken. "We were heading to Oregon to start over. Our farm in Illinois was destroyed during the war. Both armies came through, taking what they wanted, leaving nothing behind. Samuel served with the Union forces, came home with a limp from Gettysburg, but alive, which was more than many could say. She traced a pattern on the blanket covering her legs. We heard about free land in Oregon Territory, a chance to build something new. The flatbreads had begun to brown, filling the cabin with their warm, nutty aroma. Thomas flipped them carefully, then stirred the stew. 17 people died that morning, Rebecca continued softly. Families with children. An old couple who'd been married 50 years, all gone in minutes. She looked up, meeting Thomas's gaze directly. I should hate your people for that. Thomas returned her steady look. Many would. I thought I did at first. At the fort, I couldn't bear to look. At the Lakota women who came to trade, couldn't stand the sound of their language. Her hand drifted to Emma's makeshift cradle. But hate is a luxury I can no longer afford. My daughter needs me to survive, not to nurse grievances. The simple wisdom of her statement struck Thomas deeply. So many, both white and Lakota, clung to hatred as if it were a precious inheritance, passing it down through generations like a family heirloom. Your daughter is fortunate, he said quietly, to have a mother with such clarity. Rebecca's cheeks colored slightly at the praise. I'm just being practical, like Samuel would have wanted. Speaking of practical matters, how long can we stay here? The question encompassed many others. Was he taking her to the fort eventually? Would she be expected to travel again soon? What were his plans for them? Thomas served the stew in wooden bowls, handing one to Rebecca along with a hot flatbread. You and Emma should remain here until you've recovered your strength. The winter has only just begun. Travel will grow more difficult before it improves. Rebecca accepted the food gratefully. And you? This is your home. We're imposing on your hospitality. I built this cabin to provide shelter to those who need it, Thomas replied. Right now, that's you and your daughter. And after we've recovered, what then? It was the question Thomas had been asking himself since finding her in the snow. The practical answer was clear. Eventually, he should return her to the fort, or help her continue her journey west when conditions allowed. But something in him resisted the simplicity of this solution, though he wasn't ready to examine why. Spring brings many options, he said finally. We need not decide everything tonight. Rebecca studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. You're right. Tonight I'm just grateful for this roof, this fire, and this food. She took a bite of the stew, her expression warming with appreciation. Which is delicious, by the way. The simple compliment eased the tension that had built between them. Thomas settled on a bench near the fire with his own bowl, and they ate in companionable silence. The only sounds Emma's occasional soft noises and the crackling of the fire. Outside, stars emerged in the clear night sky, diamond bright against the velvet darkness. Inside the cabin, warmth and the fragile beginnings of trust created a small haven against the wilderness that surrounded them. Neither Rebecca nor Thomas could predict what challenges tomorrow would bring, but for this moment they had achieved a tentative peace with each other and with the circumstances that had brought them together. As Rebecca finished her meal and settled back against the pillows, her eyelids growing heavy with exhaustion, Thomas took the empty bowl from her hands. Sleep, he encouraged. You're safe here. Where will you sleep, she asked, already half drifting. Thomas gestured to a pile of furs near the hearth. I'll be comfortable there. Rest now. Rebecca's eyes closed, her breathing gradually deepening into the rhythm of true sleep. Thomas added wood to the fire, ensuring it would burn steadily through the night, then checked on Emma, who slumbered peacefully in her makeshift cradle. In the dancing firelight, he studied mother and child, unlikely survivors, unexpected guests. And somehow, though he couldn't have explained it even to himself, now under his protection by more than mere circumstance, The dream that had led him to Rebecca in the snowstorm had not been random chance. Of this he was certain. Their paths had crossed for a purpose, though that purpose remained as yet unclear. As Thomas finally settled onto his sleeping furs, he offered a silent prayer to Wagon, not for answers, but for wisdom to recognize them when they appeared. Outside, the wind whispered secrets to the pines, and the stars continued their eternal dance across the heavens, indifferent to the small human dramas unfolding beneath their gaze. Rebecca woke to the gentle sounds of a fire being stoked and the winter morning light filtering through oiled paper windows. For a moment, disorientation gripped her, the unfamiliar ceiling above, the scent of pine and smoke, the weight of fur blankets. Then memory returned in a rush. The snowstorm, Thomas finding her, Emma's birth, the journey to this cabin. Emma. Maternal instinct surged through her as she turned quickly toward the makeshift cradle beside the bed. The baby slept peacefully, one tiny fist curled beside her face, her breathing soft and even. Relief washed over Rebecca, followed by a deep gratitude that they had survived the night, the journey, all of it. "Good morning," Thomas said quietly from his position by the hearth. "How do you feel?" Rebecca took a moment to assess her body's condition. The bone-deep exhaustion remained, along with the expected soreness from childbirth, but the dangerous chill that had permeated her limbs was gone. "Better," she answered honestly. "Still tired, but warmer." Thomas nodded, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. "There's water heated for washing, and I've made tea." He gestured to a steaming cup beside the bed. "It will help with healing." Rebecca pushed herself up carefully to a sitting position, wincing slightly at the movement. The tea was dark and smelled of unfamiliar herbs, but she accepted it gratefully. The first sip was bitter but not unpleasant. "What is it?" she asked, taking another sip. "My grandmother's remedy for new mothers," Thomas replied, turning back to the fire where something was cooking in a cast-iron pot. "Raspberry leaf, nettle, and several other herbs that grow in these hills. It strengthens the blood and promotes healing." Rebecca studied him over the rim of her cup, this man who had delivered her child, who now prepared medicine for her recovery as casually as if he'd been doing so all his life. In the light of day, she could see him more clearly than she had during their journey. He was perhaps in his early 30s, his copper skin weathered from years outdoors, high cheekbones and a strong jawline giving his face a carved quality. His black hair was pulled back simply, revealing a small scar at his temple. He wore a mixture of white man's and Lakota clothing, leather leggings and moccasins beneath a flannel shirt with a beaded vest over it. "Thank you," she said, the words encompassing more than just the tea. "For everything." Thomas looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "You would have done the same for anyone in need. Would she have?" Rebecca wasn't certain. Before Clearwater Creek, perhaps. Now, with loss and grief coloring her perception of the world, would she have stopped to help a stranger, particularly one from a people she had been taught to fear? She wanted to believe she would have shown such courage. Emma stirred, making small sounds that precluded waking. Rebecca set aside her tea and reached for her daughter, lifting her from the fur-lined box with careful hands. The newborn's eyes opened, dark blue and unfocused, her bow-shaped mouth working as hunger asserted itself. As Rebecca adjusted her clothing to nurse, Thomas stood and moved toward the door. "I need to check on the animals and gather more firewood. There's breakfast. When you're ready?" His consideration for her privacy touched Rebecca. Samuel had been the same way, respectful of the intimate moments that made up a woman's life rather than embarrassed by them. It was a quality she hadn't expected to find in a stranger, much less a man from a culture so different from her own. Alone with Emma, Rebecca allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. Just days ago, she had been near despair, certain that she and her unborn child were doomed to die in the snow. the last victims of a tragedy that had begun at Clearwater Creek. Now they sat warm and safe in a solid cabin under the protection of a man who had risked his own life to save theirs. "Your entry into this world was dramatic, little one," she murmured to Emma, who nursed contentedly, tiny fingers splayed against Rebecca's skin. "But we survived, didn't we? Just like your father would have wanted." Grief tugged at her heart, as it did whenever she thought of Samuel. He would never see his daughter, never hold her or watch her grow. The profound unfairness of it threatened to overwhelm her if she dwelled on it too long. Rebecca forced her thoughts away from what could not be changed and focused instead on the immediate future. When Thomas returned, arms laden with split logs for the fire, Rebecca had finished nursing Emma and had managed to wash her face and hands with the warm water he had provided. She felt more human than she had in days, though still weak. "I should get up," she said, watching as he stacked the wood neatly beside the hearth. "I can't stay abed all day." Thomas paused in his work. "You've just given birth in a snowstorm and traveled miles through deep snow. Even the strongest Lakota woman would rest for several days after such an ordeal." "Perhaps, but I can at least sit by the fire. And I need to—" She hesitated, embarrassed by the practical necessities of her condition. Understanding crossed Thomas's face. "Of course. There's a necessary house just behind the cabin. I'll help you there. Then you can rest by the fire while we eat." The short walk to the small outbuilding proved more challenging than Rebecca had anticipated. Her legs trembled with every step, and without Thomas's steady support, she might have fallen more than once. The cold air bit at her exposed skin, a sharp reminder of how close she had come to freezing just 2 nights before. Back inside the cabin, Thomas settled her on a wooden chair near the hearth, placing Emma in her makeshift cradle within reach. The baby had fallen asleep again after nursing, her small face peaceful. "You should not push yourself too quickly," Thomas said as he ladled a thick porridge into bowls. "Recovery takes time." Rebecca accepted the bowl he offered, savoring the warmth against her palms. "Time is something I'm not sure we have," she replied. "Surely the fort will be looking for me by now. The supply wagon would have reported me missing." Thomas's expression grew thoughtful as he sat across from her with his own breakfast. "Yes, they will search, but not in this direction. They will assume you continued west toward the trading post, not south to Lakota Territory. But eventually, they might widen their search." "Perhaps." Thomas ate a spoonful of porridge before continuing. "By then, the snow will have covered our tracks completely, and few white men venture this far into these hills in winter unless they must." Rebecca contemplated this as she ate. The porridge was hearty and surprisingly flavorful, studded with dried berries and sweetened with what tasted like honey. "What if I wanted to be found?" she asked finally, watching his reaction carefully. Thomas met her gaze steadily, his dark eyes revealing nothing. "Do you?" The question hung in the air between them, more complex than its simple wording suggested. Did she want to return to the fort, to the well-meaning but stifling concern of people like Captain Blackwood and the missionary's wife? Did she want to continue west alone with an infant, pursuing a dream that had died with Samuel? Or did she want to remain here, in this strange limbo between worlds, under the protection of a man who was still largely a mystery to her? "I don't know," she admitted finally. "Everything has changed so quickly. 2 weeks ago, I had a husband and a plan for our future. Now I have a newborn daughter and no clear path forward." Thomas nodded, understanding in his expression. "The Lakota believe that when the path ahead is unclear, it is best to stay still until the Creator shows the way." "Stay still," Rebecca repeated softly. "I haven't been still since the day Samuel died. Perhaps that time has come." Thomas finished his porridge and set the bowl aside. You and Emma are welcome here until you decide your next steps. The winter will give you time to consider all paths." The generosity of his offer struck Rebecca deeply. This man owed her nothing, yet he opened his home and shared his resources without hesitation. In her experience, such kindness usually came with expectations of repayment in some form, yet Thomas asked nothing of her. "Why are you helping us?" she asked directly. "And please don't say it's simply what anyone would do. We both know that's not true." Thomas was silent for several moments, his gaze turning to the fire as if seeking answers in its dancing flames. When he looked back at Rebecca, his expression had softened slightly. "My people believe that all things are connected. In the sacred hoop of life," he said finally, "when I found you in the snow, it was not by chance, but by design. The spirits guided me to you for a purpose, though that purpose may not yet be clear to either of us." He paused, then added more pragmatically, "And I know what it is to lose everything, to have your path disappear beneath your feet. I would not wish anyone to face such a journey alone." There was a story there, something beyond the brief mention of his father's death and his time at the mission school. Rebecca sensed that Thomas had experienced losses that rivaled her own, but now was not the time to press for details. Instead, she simply nodded. "Then I accept your hospitality with gratitude. When spring comes, I'll decide our next steps." Relief flickered briefly across Thomas's features, there and gone so quickly Rebecca might have imagined it. He stood and gathered their empty bowls. "Good. Now you should rest more while I attend to some tasks outside. The weather has cleared, but more snow will come soon. I need to secure additional firewood and check my traps." "I feel useless just sitting here," Rebecca protested mildly. "Healing is not useless," Thomas countered. "It is necessary work, and caring for your daughter is the most important task of all." Rebecca couldn't argue with his logic. As Thomas prepared to leave, gathering his heavy winter coat and gloves, she settled more comfortably in the chair, drawing a blanket around her shoulders. Emma slept on, blissfully unaware of the complex adult world surrounding her. "I won't be gone long," Thomas assured her, pausing at the door. "There is water by the fire and more tea in the pot if you need it. The rifle is loaded and beside the bed, though it's unlikely you'll need it." The casual mention of the weapon reminded Rebecca sharply of the realities of their situation. Alone in wilderness territory, vulnerable to both natural elements and human threats. She nodded, acknowledging his concern. "We'll be fine," she said with more confidence than she felt. "Be careful out there." A ghost of a smile touched Thomas's lips. "Always," he replied, and then he was gone. A brief gust of cold air sweeping in before the door closed firmly behind him. Alone with her sleeping daughter, Rebecca took the opportunity to examine the cabin more thoroughly. Despite its utilitarian purpose, the space revealed much about its owner. Everything was meticulously organized, from the neatly stacked books to the carefully sorted herbs hanging from the rafters. A craftsman's tools hung on one wall, woodworking implements, well-maintained and arranged by size. Beside them hung what appeared to be traditional Lakota items, a beautifully crafted bow, several knives of different sizes, and what she recognized as a pipe, its stem decorated with feathers and beadwork. On a small table near the bed sat several carved figures, animals mostly, but also what appeared to be a woman holding a child, the details simple but evocative. Rebecca rose carefully, steadying herself against the chair before crossing to examine them more closely. The carvings were exquisite, each capturing the essence of its subject with minimal lines. She picked up a small wolf, marveling at how the wood seemed to flow, as if the animal were caught mid-stride. "You're full of surprises, Thomas Eagle Shield," she murmured to the empty cabin. A shelf above the table held items that seemed more personal, a beaded bracelet too small for a man's wrist, A tarnished silver pocket watch, a smooth stone painted with symbols Rebecca didn't recognize, and a daguerreotype in a simple wooden frame. Curiosity overcame propriety as Rebecca carefully lifted the photographic image, tilting it to catch the light. The picture showed a young Lakota woman in a dress that combined native and white styling, her expression solemn as was customary for photographs of the era. Beside her stood a younger Thomas, his hair cut short in the white man's fashion, wearing what appeared to be a school uniform. Behind them sat an older woman in traditional Lakota dress, her weathered face proud despite the obvious discomfort of the formal pose. His mother and sister, perhaps? Rebecca wondered aloud. The younger woman's features shared similarities with Thomas, the same high cheekbones and direct gaze. Emma stirred in her cradle, drawing Rebecca's attention away from her explorations. The baby's face scrunched in preparation for crying, tiny limbs stretching beneath her blanket. Rebecca hurried back to her chair as quickly as her weakened state allowed, reaching her daughter just as the first cry escaped. "Shh, little one," she soothed, lifting Emma into her arms. "Mama's here." The next hour passed in the timeless rhythm of early motherhood. Nursing, changing, comforting, all within the cocoon of warmth created by the cabin's solid walls and blazing hearth. Rebecca hummed softly as she cared for Emma, old lullabies her own mother had sung, the familiar melodies a connection to a past that sometimes felt like it belonged to another woman entirely. Thomas returned as the short winter day began its early slide toward dusk, bringing with him the sharp scent of cold air and pine. He stomped snow from his boots before entering fully, his arms laden with firewood and a burlap sack that appeared to contain something substantial. "The weather holds," he announced, setting down his burdens, "but there are signs of another storm approaching from the northwest, 2, perhaps 3 days away." He noted Rebecca's position by the fire, Emma sleeping against her shoulder. "You've been up too long. You should rest." "I'm fine," Rebecca assured him, though in truth exhaustion had begun to creep back into her limbs. "What's in the sack?" Thomas's expression brightened slightly. "Good fortune. A rabbit in one of my traps, and I found a grouse beneath a fallen tree. Fresh meat will help restore your strength." Rebecca's mouth watered at the thought. The army, rations at the fort had been adequate but uninspiring, and she had eaten little on the journey west. "That sounds wonderful. Can I help prepare it?" Thomas shook his head as he hung his coat by the door. "Not today. Tomorrow, perhaps, if you feel stronger." He knelt by the fire, adding several logs to ensure it would burn hot enough for cooking. "Tell me about your life before," he said suddenly, glancing up at her. "In Illinois, with your husband." The unexpected question caught Rebecca off guard. Thomas had been respectful of her privacy, never pressing for details about her past. His sudden interest suggested a desire to know her better, to understand the woman whose life had become so unexpectedly entwined with his own. "It was simple, I suppose," she began, shifting Emma to a more comfortable position. "We had a small farm near Springfield, 40 acres, mostly corn and wheat, with a vegetable garden and a few animals for our own use. Samuel built our cabin. Himself, smaller than this one but solid, we were happy there." The memories rose like bubbles in still water. Samuel laughing as he chased a wayward piglet around the yard, the first meal served on the table he had crafted from oak, falling asleep to the sound of rain on their roof, his arm draped protectively across her waist. "Then the war came," she continued, her voice softening. "Samuel joined the Union Army in '62 after Shiloh made it clear the fighting wouldn't end quickly. He believed in the cause. His parents had helped with the Underground Railroad when he was a boy, hiding escaped slaves on their journey north." Thomas listened intently, his hands busy preparing the rabbit for cooking. "He was an honorable man," he observed. "Yes," Rebecca agreed. Stubborn and sometimes too quick to speak his mind, but honorable to his core. She stroked Emma's downy head. He wrote whenever he could, beautiful letters full of hope for when he'd return, plans for expanding the farm, for the children it would have. She fell silent, remembering the darker letters that had come later, descriptions of battles that left thousands dead, of the hollow-eyed look of men who had seen too much death, of his growing conviction that war solved nothing, but created generations of hate. He came home in the summer of '64, Rebecca continued after a moment, wounded at Gettysburg, a bullet through his thigh that never healed quite right. He walked with a limp afterward and couldn't stand for long periods, but he was alive when so many weren't. Thomas nodded understanding in his expression. Many warriors returned from battle changed in body and spirit. It is the way of war. Yes, Rebecca agreed softly. He was changed, quieter. He had nightmares sometimes, terrible dreams that would wake him shouting orders to men long dead. But he was still Samuel, still determined to build a life together. She shifted Emma to her other shoulder, the baby's weight a comforting anchor to the present as memories threatened to pull her into the past. While he was away fighting, both armies passed through our region. They took what they needed: crops, livestock, even the wood from fences for their fires. By the time Samuel returned, the farm was barely functioning. We managed for a time, but 2 bad harvests in a row left us with debts we couldn't pay. The familiar ache of those desperate months tightened her throat. We heard about the Oregon Territory, free land for those willing to work it, fertile soil, a chance to start over completely. It seemed like the answer to our prayers. Thomas had begun to cook the rabbit, the rich aroma filling the cabin. "So you joined a wagon train west," he prompted when Rebecca fell silent. "Yes. We sold what little we had left, purchased supplies, and joined a company leaving from Independence in September. Too late in the season, many had warned, but they hadn't had the luxury of waiting until spring. There were 12 wagons when we started, families mostly, but a few single men looking for mining opportunities." The journey played out in her memory like scenes from a fever dream. The excitement of the first days on the trail, the gradual wearing down as miles of prairie stretched endlessly before them, the loss of 2 wagons at a river crossing, the death of a child from fever, the mounting tension as provisions dwindled and winter approached. "We were trying to reach Fort Hall before the heavy snow," Rebecca explained. "The guide said we could winter there safely, then continue to Oregon in spring. We pushed hard, traveling too late into the evening sometimes, taking risks we shouldn't have." She closed her eyes briefly. "That's how we came to be at Clearwater Creek at dawn, when normally we'd still have been at the previous night's camp." Thomas paused in his cooking, his expression grave. "You don't need to speak of that day if it pains you." "It does pain me," Rebecca acknowledged, "but perhaps speaking of it will help lay those ghosts to rest." She took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. "We had camped late, everyone exhausted. The guide was concerned about the weather, said a storm was approaching. We broke camp before first light, hoping to reach better shelter before it hit." The memory was so vivid, she could almost smell the campfire coffee, hear the creak of wagon wheels as they began moving in the pre-dawn darkness. The attack came just as the sun crested the horizon. Suddenly there were riders everywhere, arrows flying, rifles cracking. Samuel shouted for me to get under the wagon while he reached for his shotgun. Her voice faltered. "I saw him fall. There was nothing I could do." Thomas had stopped cooking entirely, his full attention on her story. "Witnessing the death of a loved one leaves wounds that do not show," he said quietly. Rebecca nodded, grateful for his understanding. "The soldiers found me later that morning, a patrol from Fort Abercrombie that had heard the shots. Everyone else was dead, 17 people, including 3 children. The soldiers buried them there, beside the creek. They wanted to burn the wagons, but I couldn't bear it. Those wagons held everything those families had owned, their hopes for a new life. Emma stirred against her shoulder, perhaps sensing her mother's distress. Rebecca patted her gently, drawing comfort from the solid weight of her child. At the fort, they treated me kindly enough, but there was always the question of what to do with me. A pregnant widow with no family, no resources. She gave a small, bitter laugh. Captain Blackwood suggested I marry again quickly. Several of his officers were apparently willing to take on a ready-made family out of Christian charity. Thomas's expression darkened slightly. The white man's way of solving problems is often to simply rearrange them. I refused, Rebecca continued. I couldn't imagine. It felt like a betrayal of Samuel, of everything we'd been to each other. She stroked Emma's back in slow circles. When I heard about the supply wagon heading to the trading post, I insisted on going with it. The captain argued, but I was adamant. I would continue west, as Samuel and I had planned. A brave decision, Thomas observed, returning to his cooking, though perhaps not a prudent one given the season. No, Rebecca agreed, with a rueful smile. Not prudent at all, as events proved. But I couldn't stay at the fort another day, listening to suggestions about my future, feeling the walls close in around me. I needed to move forward, even if the path wasn't clear. Thomas nodded, understanding in his expression. Sometimes the spirit knows what it needs, even when the mind questions. Perhaps that's it, Rebecca mused, though at the time, I simply felt desperate. Thomas finished preparing their meal, serving the roasted rabbit with more of the flatbread he had made the previous night. The simple food was delicious, the fresh meat flavorful and tender. Rebecca ate with genuine appetite for the first time in days, realizing how her body craved sustenance to heal and produce milk for Emma. As they ate, Thomas shared some of his own story in return, tales of his childhood among the Lakota, learning to hunt and track from his father, the deep connection to the land that had been instilled in him from his earliest days. He spoke of his mother's decision to send him to the mission school after his father's death, believing it would give him tools to survive in a changing world. She was right in many ways, he acknowledged. The knowledge I gained has helped me navigate between worlds, but the cost was high. How so? Rebecca asked, sensing the deeper story beneath his measured words. Thomas was silent for a moment, his expression distant. At the school, they tried to erase everything Lakota from us, cut our hair, forbade our language, punished any expression of our traditions or beliefs. They wanted to kill the Indian to save the man. His voice held no bitterness, only a deep, resigned understanding. Some children broke under this pressure. Others resisted and suffered for it. I learned to show them what they wanted to see while keeping my true self hidden. Rebecca thought of the photograph she had examined earlier. Thomas with short hair in a school uniform, his expression carefully neutral. That must have been terribly lonely, she said softly. It was, he agreed simply. But it taught me strength of a different kind. And when I returned to my people, I brought useful knowledge with me. Reading, writing, mathematics, an understanding of the white man's laws and ways of thinking. Do you regret it? The schooling? Thomas considered the question carefully. No, he said finally. I regret the manner of it, the cruelty, the attempt to destroy rather than simply teach. But the knowledge itself has value. It has allowed me to help my people in ways I could not have otherwise. The conversation continued. As daylight faded completely, the cabin growing darker except for the golden light cast by the fire, Rebecca found herself increasingly comfortable in Thomas's presence, his quiet dignity and thoughtful responses, creating a sense of safety she had not expected to find in the company of a stranger, particularly one from a culture she had been taught to fear. As the evening deepened, Emma woke demanding to be fed and changed. Thomas excused himself to check on the animals one last time before nightfall, giving Rebecca privacy for these intimate tasks. When he returned, she had settled in the chair again, Emma drowsing against her chest after nursing. "You should take the bed," Thomas said, shaking snow from his coat. "The temperature is dropping rapidly." "It's your bed," Rebecca protested. "I can't keep displacing you." "You are recovering from childbirth," Thomas replied with gentle firmness. "And the bed is large enough for both you and Emma. I'm comfortable by the fire." Too exhausted to argue further, Rebecca nodded gratefully. Thomas helped her to her feet and guided her to the bed, where she settled carefully with Emma beside her. The furs and blankets enveloped her in comforting warmth, and she realized suddenly how drained she felt from the day's activities and emotional conversation. "Rest now," Thomas said, drawing the covers over them both. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." As he turned to go, Rebecca caught his hand impulsively. "Thank you," she said again, the simple words inadequate for the depth of her gratitude. "For listening, for understanding, for not judging." Thomas's expression softened in the firelight. "Sleep well, Rebecca," he replied, gently disengaging his hand. "You and Emma are safe here." As he moved away to prepare his own sleeping place by the hearth, Rebecca felt her eyelids growing heavy. The last image before sleep claimed her was Thomas, silhouetted against the fire, his strong profile outlined in gold as he fed the flames that kept the winter night at bay. Days melted into weeks as December deepened toward its heart. The promised storm arrived with ferocious intensity, confining Thomas and Rebecca to the cabin for 3 days, while wind howled around the eaves and snow piled against the walls. When it finally passed, Thomas spent hours digging paths to the stable and woodpile, returning with frost clinging to his eyelashes and beard, but quietly triumphant at having secured their small domain against winter's siege. A routine gradually established itself, built around Emma's needs and the practical necessities of survival in the Dakota winter. Rebecca's strength returned more rapidly than either of them had expected, her body resilient despite the ordeal. It had endured. By the 10th day, she insisted on taking over cooking duties, learning to use the cast-iron cookware over the open hearth with Thomas's patient guidance. "My grandmother would approve of your flatbread," he commented one evening as they shared a meal of venison stew and the golden discs of bread that Rebecca had mastered. "She always said you could judge a woman's character by how she treats the fire that cooks her family's food." Rebecca smiled, pleased by the compliment. "And what would she make of my character?" "That you respect the elements, but aren't afraid of them," Thomas replied thoughtfully. "That you learn quickly and adapt to circumstances, good traits for surviving here." The casual reference to her staying here hung in the air between them, neither addressing directly the temporary nature of their arrangement or the decisions that would need to be made when spring arrived. Instead, they focused on the immediate challenges of daily life and the gradually deepening understanding between them. Thomas taught Rebecca about the land surrounding them, the different trees and their uses, the animals whose tracks marked the snow, the signs that indicated weather changes. In return, she shared knowledge from her farm upbringing, methods for preserving food, patterns for clothing that combined warmth with mobility, remedies her mother had taught her for common ailments. Emma thrived under their joint care, gaining weight steadily and growing more alert each day. Her eyes began to focus, following movement across the room, and her cries developed distinct patterns that Rebecca quickly learned to interpret. Thomas carved a proper cradle for her, a beautiful piece with flowing lines that reminded Rebecca of the small wolf figurine she had admired. "It's exquisite," she said when he presented it, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "You have a remarkable gift." "My father taught me," Thomas explained, watching as she transferred Emma to the new cradle. He said working with wood teaches patience and respect for the living things that provide it. Rebecca glanced at the carved figures on the small table. And the other carvings, they're your work as well? Thomas nodded, a hint of self-consciousness crossing his features. A way to pass the long winter evenings. Each has a story or purpose. Will you tell me about them someday? If you wish, he replied, his dark eyes meeting hers briefly before turning back to Emma, who had settled contentedly in her new bed. That evening marked a subtle shift in their relationship. The careful distance Thomas had maintained, sleeping by the fire while Rebecca took the bed, leaving the cabin when Emma needed nursing, speaking mainly of practical matters, began to ease. He showed Rebecca his books, a carefully curated collection that included volumes on natural history, mathematics, and several novels that had surprised her. "You've read Dickens?" she asked, examining a well-worn copy of David Copperfield. "3 times, Thomas admitted. The mission library had a complete set. I found his observations of society illuminating. Samuel loved his work too," Rebecca said, the memory bringing a smile rather than pain for the first time. "He would read aloud in the evenings while I mended or quilted." Later, Thomas brought out a small wooden flute, its surface polished from years of handling. "This might help Emma sleep," he suggested when the baby grew fussy one evening. The music that flowed from the simple instrument transformed the cabin. Sweet, haunting melodies that seemed to rise and fall, like the wind itself filled the space, weaving a spell of tranquility that soothed not only Emma, but Rebecca as well. She found herself transported by the pure, clear notes, her eyes closing as tension she hadn't realized she carried melted from her shoulders. When the final note faded, Rebecca opened her eyes to find Thomas watching her, an unreadable expression on his face. "That was beautiful," she said softly. "I've never heard anything quite like it." "The cedar flute is sacred to my people," he explained, his voice equally soft. "It gives voice to prayers too deep for words." The intimacy of the moment wrapped around them like a warm blanket. For the first time since Clearwater Creek, Rebecca felt truly present, not merely surviving from one moment to the next, but actually experiencing the fullness of being alive. A loud crack from the fire broke the spell, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. Thomas set aside the flute and rose to add more wood, the practical gesture restoring the normal rhythms of their coexistence. Yet something had changed. A door opened that could not be entirely closed again. The days continued their measured progress toward winter solstice, the shortest day of the year. Thomas explained that his people marked this time with special ceremonies, acknowledging the sun's weakest point before its gradual strengthening. "We remember that even in the darkest time, light is preparing to return," he said, as they watched the early sunset paint the snow-covered valley in shades of gold and rose. "It teaches patience and faith in the cycles of life." Christmas approached, a fact Rebecca had almost forgotten in the timeless quality of their isolated existence. It was Thomas who reminded her, returning from checking his trap lines with a small pine tree slung over his shoulder. "I thought Emma should have a proper Christmas," he explained almost shyly in response to Rebecca's surprised expression. "Even if she's too young to remember it." The gesture nearly undid her composure. This man, raised in traditions so different from her own, had remembered and honored her cultural celebration. Together they set up the small tree near the fire, decorating it with items Thomas produced from a carved wooden box, pine cones dipped in beeswax, feathers tied with sinew, small carved stars painted with juice from berries. "These are beautiful," Rebecca said, holding a delicate star ornament. "Did you make them?" A shadow crossed Thomas's face briefly. "Some. Others were made by someone else, long ago." Rebecca sensed the pain behind his cryptic answer but didn't press. Instead, she contributed to their makeshift Christmas by fashioning a small doll for Emma from scraps of cloth and yarn that Thomas provided from his mending supplies. Her first attempt was clumsy, her fingers out of practice with such fine work, but the result had a certain rustic charm that pleased her. Her first Christmas gift, she said, placing the doll beneath the tree. Though I'm afraid it's a poor offering compared to your beautiful cradle. It is made with love, Thomas replied simply. There is no greater gift. On Christmas Eve, Thomas surprised her again by producing a small pouch of dried cranberries and a precious handful of walnuts he must have been saving for months. Together, they created a feast of venison roasted with herbs, corn cakes sweetened with honey, and a simple pudding made with the dried fruit and nuts. As they ate by firelight, the small tree glowing with reflected flame, Rebecca felt a contentment that seemed almost traitorous, given the circumstances that had brought her here. Should she be happy, sitting in a warm cabin with a virtual stranger, while Samuel lay cold in the ground at Clearwater Creek? Yet she knew with certainty that her husband would not have wanted her to refuse comfort and kindness out of some misplaced sense of loyalty to his memory. "A penny for your thoughts," Thomas said, breaking into her reverie. The familiar expression, so unexpected from him, made Rebecca smile. "I was thinking about Samuel," she admitted, "about what he would make of all this." Thomas studied her, face in the firelight. "And what conclusion did you reach? That he would be grateful his wife and daughter found shelter and friendship when they needed it most?" She met Thomas's gaze directly. "That he would thank you for saving what was precious to him when he no longer could." Something indefinable shifted in Thomas's expression. "Your husband was a fortunate man," he said quietly, "to have inspired such loyalty and love." The moment stretched between them, laden with unspoken thoughts. Then Emma stirred in her cradle, breaking the tension with perfect timing. As Rebecca moved to attend to her daughter, she felt Thomas's eyes follow her, his gaze a tangible weight against her skin. Later, after Emma had been fed and settled back to sleep, they sat together near the fire, the conversation turning to lighter topics. Books they had both read, places they had seen, childhood memories untouched by later sorrows. It was the most relaxed evening they had shared. The artificial barrier of cultural difference temporarily set aside in favor of human connection. When Rebecca finally rose to retire, drowsiness making her movements languid, she paused beside Thomas's chair. "Thank you," she said softly, "for the tree, the meal, all of it. This could have been a very sad day, but instead, she trailed off, unable to fully articulate the mixture of gratitude and confused emotions swirling within her. Thomas stood, suddenly very close in the small space between chair and hearth. "Christmas is about hope, born in unlikely circumstances," he said, his voice low and warm. "It seemed fitting to honor it this year." Rebecca nodded, acutely aware of his proximity, of the scent of pine and smoke that clung to his clothing, of the steady depth in his dark eyes as they held hers. For a breathless moment, she thought he might reach for her, and more surprisingly, she realized she wanted him to. Instead, Thomas stepped back slightly, breaking the spell. "Sleep well, Rebecca," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Tomorrow is Christmas Day." Christmas morning dawned clear and brilliantly cold, sunlight streaming through the oiled paper windows to cast golden patterns across the cabin floor. Rebecca woke to find Thomas already up, the fire built high and coffee brewing on the hearth. Emma slept peacefully in her cradle, one tiny fist curled beside her face. "Merry Christmas," Thomas greeted her, offering a steaming cup as she sat up in bed. "Merry Christmas," she echoed, accepting the coffee gratefully. The previous night's moment of connection hung between them, neither acknowledging nor entirely forgetting it. After breakfast, Thomas presented her with a small package wrapped in a scrap of clean buckskin. For Emma, he explained. And for you. Rebecca unwrapped it carefully to find a necklace, a small leather pouch suspended on a cord of braided sinew, decorated with tiny blue beads in a flowing pattern. It's a medicine pouch, Thomas explained as she examined it. Inside are herbs and small tokens for protection and good fortune. Among my people, every child receives one at their naming ceremony. The gift touched Rebecca deeply, not just for its beauty and meaning, but for the acceptance it represented. Thomas was welcoming Emma into his world, offering her the protections of his traditions alongside her own. It's perfect, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you. It should be worn close to the heart, Thomas instructed. When she's older, she can wear it herself. For now, he gestured toward Rebecca. Understanding, she slipped the cord over her head, the small pouch resting against her chest. I'll keep it safe for her until then. Thomas nodded, satisfaction in his expression. Good. Now there is one more Christmas tradition we should observe. Before Rebecca could ask what he meant, he crossed to the door and opened it, stepping outside briefly. When he returned, he carried a small bundle of green leaves tied with a red thread. Mistletoe, its white berries gleaming in the firelight. Where did you find that? Rebecca asked in astonishment. I wouldn't have thought it grew in these parts. It doesn't, not commonly, Thomas replied, a rare smile lighting his features. I traded for it at the fort before winter set in. The quartermaster's wife had some scent from back east. You planned this even then? Rebecca couldn't hide her surprise. Before you even knew I existed. Thomas's smile faded slightly, his expression growing more serious. I had my reasons, he said cryptically, but now it seems to have found its proper purpose. He hung the mistletoe from a hook near the door, then turned back to Rebecca. In your tradition, does it not call for a kiss? The direct question caught her off guard. She had not expected such familiarity with Christian customs from him, nor such boldness in invoking them. Yes, she admitted, a flush warming her cheeks, though it's usually just an excuse for sweethearts to steal a kiss at holiday gatherings. Thomas approached slowly, giving her ample time to retreat or object. We have few enough traditions to share, he said quietly. Perhaps we should honor those we find. Rebecca remained still, her heart suddenly racing as Thomas stopped before her. This was madness, she thought distantly. She was a widow of mere months, a new mother, a white woman in a Lakota man's cabin. Every social convention she had ever known forbade what was about to happen. Yet when Thomas gently tilted her chin upward, his touch feather-light against her skin, she did not pull away. His eyes searched hers, seeking permission, offering one last chance to maintain the careful distance they had preserved. Rebecca gave the slightest nod, and Thomas lowered his head slowly, pressing his lips to hers in a kiss so gentle it might have been a whisper. For a heartbeat, neither moved, the simple contact a bridge across worlds of difference. Then Thomas drew back, his expression carefully controlled despite the warmth in his eyes. Merry Christmas, Rebecca Winters, he said softly. Merry Christmas. Thomas Eagle Shield, she replied, her voice steadier than she had expected. The moment passed, fragile as frost patterns on glass, but leaving an indelible impression on both. They moved through the rest of the day with outward normality, preparing. Meals tending to Emma, discussing practical matters of firewood and provisions. Yet beneath the familiar routine ran a current of awareness that had not existed before. That night, as Rebecca nursed Emma before sleep, she found herself studying Thomas covertly as he read by firelight. The strong profile, the capable hands turning pages with careful precision, the quiet dignity that seemed as much a part of him as his physical presence. What was happening between them? Was it merely proximity and gratitude creating an illusion of connection, or something more substantive? And what would come of it when spring arrived and decisions could no longer be postponed? As if sensing her thoughts, Thomas looked up from his book, his dark eyes meeting hers across the cabin. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence laden with unasked questions. "You're troubled," he observed finally. Rebecca sighed, shifting Emma to her shoulder to pat the baby's back gently. "Confused might be a better word," she admitted. Thomas closed his book, giving her his full attention. About? How to answer without revealing too much of her heart's uncertainty. Rebecca chose her words carefully. About what happens when the snow melts. About where Emma and I belong in a world that seems to have no place prepared for us. Thomas nodded slowly, accepting the deflection for what it was, a step back from the precipice they had approached earlier. "The future is never certain," he said, "but you have time to consider all paths before choosing one." "Do I?" Rebecca asked, more sharply than she'd intended. "The fort will be searching for me when weather permits. If they find me here..." She trailed off, the implications clear to both of them. Thomas's expression hardened slightly. "You fear they would not understand your presence here." "Can you honestly say they would?" Rebecca challenged. "A white woman living unchaperoned. With a Lakota man, they would assume the worst, regardless of the truth." "And what is the truth, Rebecca?" Thomas asked quietly, his directness catching her off guard. She looked down at Emma, now sleeping peacefully against her shoulder, buying time to compose her thoughts. "The truth is that you saved our lives," she said finally, "that you've shown nothing but kindness and respect, that without you, Emma would never have known her first Christmas." She paused, then added more softly, "That I don't know what I want anymore, only what I don't want, to return to the fort and their plans for my future." Thomas absorbed this, his expression thoughtful. "Then perhaps that is enough truth for now," he said. "The rest will reveal itself in time." The conversation might have continued, but a sharp crack from outside drew Thomas's attention. He rose, quickly moving to the window with the silent grace that always reminded Rebecca of his life as a scout and hunter. "What is it?" she asked, tension tightening her shoulders. "Probably just a branch breaking under snow weight," Thomas replied, though his posture remained alert. "But I should check to be sure." He pulled on his heavy coat and took his rifle from its place beside the door, the practiced movements revealing a wariness Rebecca hadn't seen in days. "Lock the door behind me," he instructed. "I won't be long." Rebecca complied, turning the heavy wooden latch after he departed. With Thomas gone, the cabin suddenly seemed less secure, the darkness beyond the windows more threatening. She placed Emma in her cradle and moved restlessly around the small space, listening intently for any sound from outside. Long minutes passed with no sign of Thomas's return. Rebecca fed more wood to the fire, the familiar task doing little to calm her growing unease. Just as she was debating whether to take the spare pistol Thomas had shown her and go looking for him, the door latch rattled. "Rebecca, it's me," Thomas called softly. "Open the door." She hurried to comply, relief washing over her at the sight of him whole and unharmed. But her relief turned quickly to concern as she noted his expression, grave and troubled in a way she hadn't seen before. "What's wrong?" she asked, closing the door behind him. "What did you find?" Thomas removed his coat, brushing snow from its shoulders before hanging it by the door. "Tracks," he said simply. "Fresh ones, made since this morning. Men on horseback, at least 3, maybe 4. Rebecca's hand flew to her throat, where Emma's medicine pouch rested beneath her dress. "The fort? Are they searching for me already?" "No." Thomas shook his head. "Not soldiers. The tracks don't match army mounts or equipment." He hesitated, then added, "They circled the cabin once, then continued eastward. They know we're here." "Who then? Other settlers?" "Few white settlers would venture this deep into Lakota territory, especially in winter." Thomas checked that his rifle was properly loaded before setting it within easy reach. More likely hunters or traders from one of the bands wintering nearby. "Your people," Rebecca said, understanding dawning. "Would they? Is there danger?" Thomas considered her question carefully. Not immediate danger, no. If they meant harm, they would have acted already. But their presence complicates matters. How so? A white woman and child in a Lakota man's cabin raises questions among my people just as it would among yours, Thomas explained. Different questions perhaps, but questions nonetheless. Rebecca sank into a chair, the implications sinking in. What will they do? Watch, for now. Possibly send someone to speak with me soon. Thomas sat across from her, his expression serious. "I need to ask you something, Rebecca, and I need an honest answer." She nodded, sensing the importance of the moment. "Of course. If visitors come, Lakota visitors, will you stay hidden as we discussed for white travelers, or will you meet them openly at my side?" The question cut to the heart of their ambiguous situation. Since their earliest days in the cabin, they had agreed that if white travelers appeared, Rebecca would hide in the small root cellar beneath the floor to avoid difficult explanations. But Thomas had never raised the possibility of his own people visiting, had never asked how she would respond to such an encounter. "Would they harm Emma or me?" she asked, needing to understand the risks. "No," Thomas assured her, "not while under my protection, but they would have many questions, some of which might be uncomfortable for you." Rebecca considered this, weighing fear against dignity, practicality against principle. "I won't hide," she decided finally. "Emma and I exist, and we're here in your home because you chose to save us. I won't pretend otherwise, even if it means facing difficult questions." Relief flickered across Thomas's features, there and gone. So quickly she nearly missed it. "Good," he said simply. "That makes matters simpler in some ways, more complex in others." "What do you mean?" "If you hide, the questions would be fewer, but the suspicions greater. If you stand openly, the questions will be many, but more easily answered with truth." He leaned forward, his expression intensifying. "But you should understand what that truth will suggest to my people." Rebecca swallowed hard, suddenly nervous under his steady gaze. "And what is that?" "That you are under my protection, not merely as a temporary guest, but as something more permanent." Thomas held her gaze unflinchingly. "A woman living in a man's home, raising a child there. Among my people, this speaks of a bond more binding than words." The implication hung in the air between them, impossible to misinterpret. "You mean they would think we are together?" Rebecca said, the last word barely audible. "Yes." Thomas's directness was both unsettling and strangely comforting. No games, no pretense, simply truth laid bare. "Is that a role you're willing to accept, even as a necessary fiction?" Rebecca's mind raced. What Thomas proposed was scandalous. By white standards, a widow pretending to be the partner of a Lakota man to avoid more difficult explanations. Yet the alternative was potentially more dangerous, inviting suspicion and possibly hostility from people whose territory they occupied. And if she were truly honest with herself, was it entirely a fiction? The kiss they had shared earlier, brief though it was, had awakened feelings she had thought buried with Samuel. The easy companionship that had developed between them over the past weeks, the growing trust, the moments of connection that transcended their different backgrounds, all suggested a foundation for something genuine, however unlikely or ill-advised. "It wouldn't be entirely a fiction," she said finally, her voice steadier than she expected. "You have been more than a reluctant host or a temporary protector. You've been..." She searched for the right word. "A friend, a companion, someone I've come to trust and respect." Thomas's expression softened. "And you have become important to me as well," he admitted. "More than I anticipated when I found you in the snow." The quiet acknowledgement sent warmth spreading through Rebecca's chest. Before she could respond, however, Emma began to stir in her cradle, her small sounds of wakefulness a reminder of the practical realities that existed alongside these complicated emotions. As Rebecca rose to attend to her daughter, Thomas remained seated, his expression thoughtful. "We should prepare for visitors," he said. "They may come as early as tomorrow, depending on the weather and their purpose." Rebecca nodded, lifting Emma from her cradle. "What should I do?" "Be yourself," Thomas advised. "Answer questions honestly, but remember that our languages view the world differently. What sounds reasonable in English may translate strangely into Lakota, and the reverse is equally true." "Will you interpret for me?" Rebecca asked, suddenly anxious about communication barriers. "Of course." Thomas rose, moving to check the cabin supplies. "But more importantly, I will stand beside you. That will speak more clearly than any words." Udi, as she nursed Emma, Rebecca contemplated the strange turn her life had taken. From respectable farmer's wife to widow, from solitary traveler to, what? Partner to a Lakota man? A woman caught between worlds, much as Thomas himself was caught. The path ahead remained unclear, yet for the first time since Samuel's death, she felt something like hope stirring in her heart. Fragile as new spring growth, but persistent nonetheless. Outside, the winter night deepened, stars emerging like diamond chips against black velvet. Inside the cabin, warmth and uncertainty mingled as two people from vastly different worlds considered a future neither had imagined possible just weeks before. Whether that future would be allowed to flourish remained to be seen, but in this moment, on this night, it existed as a possibility. A candle flame in the darkness, small but bright with promise. The visitors arrived at midday, 3 riders appearing like shadows against the snow-bright landscape. Thomas spotted them first, his keen eyes noting their approach while they were still distant specks on the horizon. "They're coming," he said, simply turning from the window to where Rebecca sat mending beside the fire, Emma sleeping peacefully in her cradle. Rebecca set aside her work, her fingers suddenly clumsy with nervousness. "Your people." Thomas nodded, his expression calm but watchful. "My mother's cousin, running horse, and 2 others. I recognize his riding posture." "The chief you mentioned?" Rebecca's heart quickened. A tribal leader's visit carried implications beyond an ordinary social call. "Yes, his presence is significant." Thomas moved with deliberate calm, adding wood to the fire and putting coffee on to boil. His practiced efficiency spoke of hospitality. Rituals performed countless times, yet Rebecca noted the tension in his shoulders, the careful precision of each movement. "What does it mean that he comes himself?" Thomas paused, selecting his words carefully. "It means this visit is official, not merely curious. He comes as both family and leader." Rebecca smoothed her skirts, suddenly conscious of her appearance, her faded dress, her hair simply braided rather than arranged in the more formal styles she'd once worn. "Should I change? I have the blue dress still." "No," Thomas interrupted gently. "You should be as you are." Pretense would be noticed and misunderstood. As the riders drew nearer, Thomas handed Rebecca a small bundle wrapped in soft leather. "I meant to give you this later, but now seems appropriate." Inside, she found a beaded hair ornament, the intricate design featuring blues and whites arranged in a flowing pattern reminiscent of water. "It's beautiful," she said, genuinely touched by the unexpected gift. "It belonged to my sister," Thomas explained, his voice softening. "She would want you to have it." The mention of his sister, the first time he had acknowledged her directly, struck Rebecca as profoundly important. Before she could respond, the sound of horses arriving outside drew their attention. "Remember," Thomas said quietly, "you are under my protection. Stand tall and speak your truth." He squeezed her hand briefly, then moved to the door. Rebecca quickly fastened the hair ornament at the end of her braid, then gathered Emma in her arms. The baby had awakened, her eyes wide and curious, as if sensing the significance of the moment. Thomas opened the door to greet his visitors, speaking in Lakota. The words were unfamiliar to Rebecca, but the tone conveyed respect and welcome. After a brief exchange, he stepped aside, gesturing for the men to enter. The 3 Lakota men filed into the cabin, their imposing presence making the space seem suddenly smaller. The leader, Running Horse, Rebecca presumed, was an older man, with a deeply lined face and penetrating dark eyes that missed nothing. He wore a mixture of traditional Lakota clothing and items clearly obtained through trade with whites. The other 2 men were younger, perhaps Thomas's age or slightly older, their expressions more openly curious as they surveyed the cabin and its occupants. Thomas introduced them in English for Rebecca's benefit. "My uncle, Chief Running Horse, of the Minneconjou, his son Swifthawk and his nephew Stone Calf." He then spoke to them in Lakota, gesturing toward Rebecca and Emma. Though she couldn't understand the words, Rebecca recognized her name and Emma's in the flow of unfamiliar sounds. Running Horse studied her intently, his gaze direct, but not unkind. Then, to her surprise, he spoke in accented but clear English. "The woman from the snow," he said, "my nephew's dream visitor." Rebecca blinked in surprise, both at his use of English and the reference to Thomas's dream. "Yes," she confirmed, meeting his gaze with as much dignity as she could muster. "My daughter and I would have died without his help." Running Horse nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already knew. "The spirits guide those who listen," he said, glancing at Thomas, "some more clearly than others." The visitors seated themselves near the fire at Thomas's invitation, accepting coffee but declining food with a gesture that suggested they had eaten recently. An awkward silence descended, broken only by Emma's occasional soft noises. Finally, Running Horse spoke directly to Rebecca. "The soldiers at the fort search for you," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "They believe you are lost or taken." The blunt statement sent a chill through Rebecca. "How do you know this?" "We trade at the fort sometimes," Swifthawk answered, his English more hesitant than his father's. "Hear stories. White woman with child, lost in snow. Captain offers reward for information." Thomas's expression darkened at this news, though he remained silent, allowing the conversation to unfold. "I'm not lost," Rebecca said firmly, drawing Emma closer, "and certainly not taken against my will. I'm here by choice." Running Horse's weathered face revealed nothing of his thoughts as he digested this. "A strange choice for a white woman," he observed, "to live among those your people call enemies." "The men who attacked my wagon train were enemies," Rebecca acknowledged. "But Thomas is not. He saved us when my own kind abandoned us to die." Her direct response seemed to please the chief, a flicker of approval crossing his stoic features. "You speak without fear," he noted. "Good. Fear makes the tongue lie." The conversation shifted then, Running Horse speaking at length in Lakota to Thomas, occasionally gesturing toward Rebecca and Emma. Though excluded by the language barrier, Rebecca sensed the discussion concerned their future, the implications of her presence here, the potential complications when spring arrived. Thomas responded with equal gravity, his normally reserved expression animated as he argued some point. Occasionally, Swifthawk or Stone Calf would interject, their tones questioning or concerned. Finally, Thomas turned to Rebecca. "They believe the army will send scouts this way when the snow begins to melt," he explained. My uncle offers us shelter with the tribe if needed, deeper in Lakota Territory where soldiers rarely venture. The us in his statement caught Rebecca's attention immediately. Not her and Emma alone, but Thomas as well. A collective future, assumed without question. "And if we stay here?" she asked. "Then we must be prepared for difficult questions from both worlds," Thomas replied honestly. "Questions with no easy answers." Running Horse spoke again, this time directing his words to Rebecca despite the language she couldn't understand. Thomas translated, "He says Emma carries two worlds in her blood now, the one she was born to and the one that kept her alive. Both have claim to her spirit, and she will be stronger for it if we are wise enough to teach her both ways." Tears pricked Rebecca's eyes at the unexpected acceptance in the chief's words. "Tell him I want that for her," she said softly, "to know the best of both worlds, not just one." After Thomas translated, Running Horse nodded solemnly, then reached into a pouch at his belt. He withdrew a small object and extended it toward Emma, a tiny moccasin, exquisitely crafted from soft leather and decorated with beadwork. "For when she walks between worlds," he said in English, placing it carefully in Rebecca's free hand. The gift, symbolic and practical at once, moved Rebecca deeply. "Thank you," she said, meeting the chief's eyes directly, "for your welcome and your wisdom." The visit concluded shortly afterward, the men departing with the same dignified solemnity with which they had arrived. As their horses disappeared into the distance, Rebecca turned to Thomas, questions bubbling to her lips. "What else did they say? What was decided?" Thomas smiled slightly, the tension he had carried throughout the visit finally easing from his shoulders. "Much was said about spirits and signs, about obligations to both blood and heart." He took her hand, his fingers warm against hers. "But, most importantly, they acknowledged you and Emma as under my protection, and offered their protection as well, should we need it." "As family?" Rebecca asked, the word carrying weight beyond its simple syllables. "As family," Thomas confirmed, his dark eyes holding hers steadily. "If that is what you wish." Rebecca looked down at Emma, sleeping peacefully now, unaware of the momentous discussions that had centered around her tiny existence. Then she raised her gaze to Thomas, this man who had saved them in the storm, who had opened not just his home, but his heart to a widow and her fatherless child. "I think," she said slowly, certainty growing with each word, "that Emma and I have finally found where we belong." Thomas's smile deepened, reaching his eyes in a way she had rarely seen. Outside, the winter sun gleamed on endless snow, its light promising that even the deepest cold eventually yields to spring's renewal. Inside, a family forged in the harshest circumstances looked toward a future neither had imagined possible, a bridge between worlds built on foundations stronger than difference or prejudice. Love, freely given and gratefully received. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.